Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV, and welcome to a special edition of Forbidden Planet TV. Rian Hughes is a very old friend of mine and my former housemate, in fact. And believe me, those are two of his least important achievements. He is an award-winning designer, an award-winning comic book artist, an award-winning typographist. If you ever use a variety of fonts in your work, you will almost certainly be using fonts designed by Rian. He is also the designer of many, many comic book logos, all of the greatest comic book logos from all of the greatest DC comics over the last 20 years. And Rian has now delivered the novel he's been working on for the last 10 years. It's called XX, a novel graphic, and you can order it from the links attached to this video. And here is XX, which is an amazing science fiction novel, all 977 pages of it. And so, like I said, it's a special edition of Forbidden Planet TV today. Rian was in conversation with his old friend and frequent collaborator, Grant Morrison, for the Strand bookstore in Manhattan about the genesis of XX and about the content of XX, which is a book you really want to check out. So we're giving over this special session to Grant and Rian, talking about all 977 pages of XX at the Strand bookstore. And again, you can order this book from the links attached to this video. Enjoy.
Hey, Grant,
hey, Rian.
How are you doing?
Ryan, how you doing?
I'm very well. I'm very well.
Yeah, there was a few tense moments there with our attempts to communicate. But
yeah, for those who
here's to XX, and congratulations on the release at last.
No, thank you so much. Let me join you in the drink if I can get this out of the box.
Please do.
Okay. So you actually saw a copy of this years ago, didn't you? When it was still a kind of print-on-demand thing, and you read.
Yeah, well, even more though. What I wanted to talk to you about first was because you've spoken to me about this idea for a long time. I remember you spoke about XX, and even prior to that, the red square idea that kind of melted into this.
Yes.
And at what point, because back then you were talking about doing a graphic novel, a comic book, which was, very heavily typographical and dealing with a lot of these ideas. At what point did you finally just think, I want to write this as a novel and do it myself and not have to rely on anyone else? And what's the difference from that? The difference between the graphic novel and your decision to do the novel graphic, it's what was that jump? What were you thinking about when you made that decision to go from the comic version to this?
That's a good question. My original idea, which I think you saw, which was called Red Square, was all about sort of semiotics. It was all about colours and squares and things like that. And it was me trying to sort of drill down into the basic language of graphic design and what it means and how you can use it to to communicate. And so a sort of
Freudian slip there.
And an early version of that ended up by being culture. Ideas can be
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, because so many of the ideas are almost given a test run in culture.
Cheers, by the way. Thank you for joining, everyone. I know no one's got the book yet, so withhold. Come back when you've read it and tell me what you think. So a lot of the stuff, but culture wasn't culture was more like an extended essay, and I always thought that what I really needed to do was try and turn this into some kind of narratives, because if you're going to try and sort of push certain boundaries, it's much easier to do it in a way where people are involved in characters and there's a story and there's a journey, and it's not a didactic lecture. It's actually just an enjoyable pulpy romp in a way. And so XX came out of that as sort of an experiment to see what you could do with the form of the novel and with typography as a sort of broader form of expression. So you don't, there have been novels before that deal with the way that the type is laid out on the page, but I think they've generally been written by one person, then designed by another person after the fact. So they're not sort of perceived as being one thing, or conceived, I should say, as being one thing. So I wanted to see, and when you're as a graphic designer, you're very aware of the fact that you can speak in different tones of voices depending on what kind of font you use. So it seems like a complete natural that you could use this just to tell a story, and so my challenge was how to make that work in a way where it didn't feel like the typographic design bit was just a kind of add-on to a story that probably would have worked quite well without it. It had to be essentially, it had to be part of the core aspect of the novel.
But the typography is illustrative, it almost takes the place of what would have been drawings in a comic book. So it's very much it's on the page as an illustration as well as the sense that you get from just the words of it. The immediate impact of it is much more than the words. Those explosive kind of Dada graphics, you can feel the emotion of it before you even read the words in that.
Well, I think also, if you're used to comics, you're used to sort of the way that sound effects work and the position of the type on the page works, and the size of the type and all these kind of things. And so in comics, they've had this sort of expressive range in the way that the type is done pretty much since the beginning of comics, but not really in the written novel. The written novel has been sort of stripped down to the barest of, the language may be rich, but the semiotics, the way that it's actually put on the page, is the opposite. This is why Kindles work, is that you can just put your words through a pipeline and it can come out the other end in Comic Sans or Courier, and it'll still be exactly the same story. So it just seemed like it was. I was kind of curious as to why most novels didn't look like this.
Well, it's just because no one had chosen to do it, and no one had the range of skill to be able to do it as one person. Perhaps, like you say, things have been tried, but most of the stuff I've seen it's kind of been like concrete poetry. It's very much the typography isn't the thing. It's maybe the arrangement of the letters that's supposed to symbolize something. But this was much more. It was the sound, like I say, the explosive, those circular spiraling Dada graphics or futurist graphics that they work like music, I think, more than almost, they're illustrated, but they work like music in the sense that the meaning is conveyed immediately by that. And I wonder, is that the thing of the novel graphic, is to take the word and turn the word into this expressive, illustrative thing in the way that the graphic novel takes the image and tries to do that?
Well, I think yes, and I think that I think there's a spectrum. Everything's on a spectrum these days, but you have.
We all are.
At one end, you have what we are familiar with, that might be, say, illustration or fine art, and at the other end, you have pure text in a novel. And in between, you have everything else, and everything else includes comics, but it probably also includes magazines or storyboards or these other things that sort of mix the two. And I think that we're familiar. I mean, everyone is familiar with how words and images relate. I mean, the language of advertising, for example, or T-shirts and signage, and the whole environment is full of words and images together. We're completely familiar with this. So it's kind of weird that hasn't seeped into the novel more than it has. And I think also at the other end of the spectrum with a regular comic, I think that whereas sort of the novel might be hidebound by certain conventions, I think the comic is as well. And I think that there have been people who have always deconstructed the comic in terms of the way that the frames are arranged on the page. Everyone from Will Eisner through Frank Miller to other people who have sort of played with the fact that it's a window into a world, but it's also a thing of itself on the page. And I think this is something this is one of the things I really like your work, is that it plays that double game of being, on the one hand, a story about something, but on the other hand, aware that it is a story, aware that it is ink on paper. And I think this is the kind of essence of modernism in a way, which is I mean, the XX of the title is a character who represents the 20th century and everything, all the art movements of the 20th century, from sort of Dada and the kind of early proto-punk of the futurists through to the sort of brutalists and the kind of Helvetica range left sort of modernists.
Even the disintegration of ideas, in physics, and 20th century was a complete overhaul of everything, from art through literature, through the physics, through everything that we were thinking of, and that character, that XX, which obviously is 20th century, is an embodiment of that. But when you move beyond that to the next century and the previous centuries, the way you play those characters and what they represent, I think is fascinating. Because to me, I remember the original version of XX was about the 20th century, but the fact that you've expanded beyond that, I thought was fascinating, and having the Girl 21 and the 19th count as representatives of completely different zeitgeists, as you say.
Yeah, well, I think that they all argue with each other on the page, which I thought was a sort of a nice conceit. So for those of you who've not got the book, or maybe have not sort of seen pictures of it yet, all these different characters sort of talk in different ways on the page. So when the 19th Count, who's the sort of essence, the zeitgeist of the 19th century, talks, it's like a Victorian bill poster. So it's in those really sort of solid wood types. And then the third character you meet is Girl 21, who talks in tweets and with emojis and all the kind of language that sort of Twitter has brought upon us. So and I kind of imagine that maybe there's hundreds or even thousands of these characters. It's like the multiverse. They go on through the centuries. Sort of, they're kind of coalesced. The idea is that they're kind of memeplexes. So in the novel, a signal from outer space of unknown origin has been received by Jodrell Bank, and this has been leaked onto the internet, and people don't know what it is. They assume that it's a message, but it becomes more and more apparent that it's not a message from aliens. This is a bit of a spoiler here. It's not a message from aliens. It is the aliens in digital form. And so what happens is, because these aliens are not physical, they don't exist in three-dimensional space. They exist in a kind of, they exist in idea space. They exist in a space that's congruent with our three-dimensional reality, but it's the internet. It's sort of, it exists in some sort of cultural or mimetic realm rather than a physical realm. And when our characters sort of go into this realm, trying to look at these aliens, they realize that it's already full of all these other characters that we've created. And these are the spirits, the sort of zeitgeists of the 20th century, of modernism, of the 19th Count, who's like a sort of spotless white dandy in a top hat, and Girl 21, who you never see Girl 21's face, because she doesn't, she basically, her face is like an animated stutter of selfies that she's stolen from a million
faces that all look like Kim Kardashian.
Exactly. So they're sort of zeitgeists that are sort of built out of the particulars of their age. So when they get to see what XX looks like, he looks a bit like sort of Epstein's rock drill sculpture, sort of crossed with a sort of Wyndham Lewis cubist self-portrait, and he's got that sort of, fury and bombast of the sort of the best of sort of Marinetti's futurist manifestos, or
the poetry of that is great. You really capture that. I just love it. I was reading it again today, and just that as you say, the Marinetti style, the declamatory, the sizzling molecular motion of cities and fire, that kind of thing. I just thought it was great.
I love all that stuff. I mean, I think that sort of like growing up sort of in the 80s, when for some reason all of that stuff was in popular culture, it sort of seeped into me through, it was appropriated by people like Peter Saville and a lot of the kind
Jamie Reed and the punk stuff was all taken from that, obviously.
Yeah. So it's sort of all of that sort of the early modernism of the 20th century I came across through pop culture rather than through sort of reading books on these people firsthand, and then I sort of went and discovered who they really were. So I sort of I came across the appropriators before I went to the source. So I decided that I would probably do the same, is sort of reappropriate them for my own ends, and maybe people can go off and look at the source again.
But also, I mean, right, it's a really, really big book. This is a massive book, and and I said it was the best genre book of the last like probably 3,000 years. But it's not, to me. It's not genre. It's beyond that. But the fact that you've chosen science fiction as a way to almost couch some of these ideas, and there is a kind of thriller plot in there as well, which I like. So, was science fiction the best vehicle for this? I mean, it has the trappings of science fiction, but beyond that, I feel it's like something like House of Leaves, where it has all these different versions of how we tell stories to one another. There's poetry, there are reports, there are interviews, there are you're taken from all of this stuff, and was that important to do that, to talk about all the different methods we use, lists, indices, everything is in there.
Well, I thought that anything that involved words and images was fair game. In fact, I'm sort of slightly bizarre that I didn't actually have any comic strips in there. So maybe the next thing I do should probably have a sort of an interlude where I actually have a full-on comic strip. But yeah, I think no, you're right. Anything that sort of can hold meaning, whether that be something as utilitarian as a sort of report that has no intrinsic aesthetic value whatsoever. In fact, I'm intrigued. This is one of the weird. It's a bit like sort of the way I'm sort of intrigued by brutalist concrete architecture that sort of is accidentally beautiful rather than intentionally beautiful. I'm intrigued by graphic design that isn't designed. It's sort of the kind of look of things like official reports or rubber stamps or code, machine code, things like that. It's functional. It's not aesthetic, but it has an aesthetic regardless, because everything has to look like something.
Yeah, because it can't escape from its own aesthetic, no matter how hard it tries to be bland or to be completely quotidian and something that we barely even see. It carries an aesthetic, but you make a point of that in the book.
Yes.
There's so many collisions of here are different ways to frame information.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think people understand that what a report looks like or what an email looks like. So, again, it's this tone of voice thing. It gives the text an extra level of meaning above and beyond what it says. And I think what would be really interesting, and this is something that I don't really play with that much in the book, would be to sort of play against type. For example, I saw a T-shirt recently and it said Helvetica, but it was set in a kind of Gothic black letter that wasn't Helvetica. It was about a far way from Helvetica. So you can say something and then completely contradict it by the way that you show that thing, design that thing. So I think there's even more that I could probably sort of play with there. But I think you've done this too. I mean, in The Invisibles, the sort of the way that you deconstruct language and the way that, in an almost Orwellian way, people think that if you can control what people can say or the words that they use, you can control what they think. And I think that's one of the themes that I really enjoyed, say, in The Invisibles, was that exploration of, and also the fact, and you played with this very early on in Animal Man, the way that you as the sort of omniscient narrator sort of enter your own world and characters become aware of you, the author. So there was a bit in XX in which I sort of attempted something similar, where again, without too many spoilers, one of our characters is trying to sort of shut down the sort of semiotic bandwidth, if you like, to try and have an effect. So he's sort of stripping out all of the things that language has. So he takes out punctuation, he takes out capitals. When he takes out punctuation, all the characters find that they don't know who's talking because there's not speech marks around things. And the text on the page that is not speech, in other words, it's the omniscient narrator giving you the stage directions saying, Jack said.
Yeah.
There's no difference between that and what Jack actually said. So Jack, the character, can hear me, the omniscient narrator, talking about him. It's a bit like being able to hear God or something. And then the second level is where I stripped out capitals, and capitals are used for naming. So if you take away people's names, they become just like objects. They lose their sort of selfness. So the whole idea was that within this sort of scene in the book where they're sort of doing battle with these alien ideas, is they're trying to win by, in an Orwellian way, sort of like stripping the expressive content of language away to its absolute basics. And when they do that, the sort of barriers between me as the writer and the author and the characters as characters in a book sort of get demolished. And again, I think this is something that you played with very effectively towards the end of Animal Man.
Yeah, well, I think probably like you that I cannot ignore the interface between me and the medium. I can't pretend that, say, the Marvel universe exists or that the DC universe exists. It only exists on paper. But that makes it way more real than if it existed in some other dimension and we were kind of tuning in and writing the stories of Spider-Man as he really lives somewhere undefined out there. He really lives on the page, you know. So for me, and I think like in this book is the sense of engaging with the medium itself. You cannot extricate yourself from your involvement in your own text. But I think that's where the element of excitement and fascination is, and where the novelty is. And again, one of the things I'd want to say about XS is a very original book, you know, as a science fiction book, it's got really original ideas, and the beautiful visual of guiding your workspace through an alien environment is just like it's made for film, you know. I don't think I've seen anything like it before. It's such a childlike thing to be standing at the pulpit or standing at your desk and imagining you flying the room through an alien environment filled with beings that you've never experienced before, but it's all happening within this space that doesn't actually move. So that element of the kind of the scale of it, the originality of it, I mean, you really work this. And what I want to know is, how do you do that? Because I know you work all the time, you're constantly working, but how do you write a book on this scale? And now I know you're on to the next one, which I've also read, but this is a very big, it's a compendium of all your thinking. And to me, it's like, what was the process? Did it take a long time? You know?
It did take a long time. What was bizarre is that about probably 6-7 years ago, there was an exhibition at a gallery in East London called the Protein Gallery, and it was an exhibition of something like 20 years, I can't remember exactly, of the typographic circle, which is a sort of thing for type aficionados. And they had all these they have a magazine called Circular, and they had issues of this magazine sort of open at various pages, sort of in glass cabinets. So I'm going around these cabinets, and I see an interview with me from about 20 years ago. And in this interview, that I alight upon this bit of text, and it's me saying, there must be a narrative form of graphic design in which different fonts and layouts are used in order to... So this was like 20 years ago, and I was thinking,
yeah, there must be, and then you had to go and discover it.
Yeah, I've been wasting my time. I should be doing this. So in some ways, I feel like sort of, I've been trying to do this for 20 years. I mean, the whole book did take probably about 4.5 years from beginning to end. And then there was another 1.5 years where it was sort of with agents. And then there was a bit of a bidding war, and Picador finally picked it up, which was fantastic. And thank you so much for Picador, because they've really done a good job, and they really believe in it, which I'm very, very grateful for. And but I wasn't working on it full time. It was just something that sort of I would dabble with on Sunday afternoons, and then as it became more and more this sort of actual real thing that I was close to actually finishing, I then sort of dedicated about sort of 3 or 4 months of pretty solid work on it, sort of in amongst all my other regular sort of design and illustration work, and sort of knocked it into shape. And then I did one of the versions that you saw early on, which is fairly close to how it turned out. There was some I did some pretty major surgery on it and sort of moved various elements of it around. Various people sort of read that early version and had comments which I took on board. But that was the process. It was, and I don't know what your process is like, but I think that what was interesting, and the analogy that I use is that when you're at art college, they tell you, if you're doing life drawing, they say, don't start with the left eye and then draw the right eye, and then sort of at the end of 2 or 3 hours, you're kind of doing the toenails down here. Yeah, what you do is you sort of draw a spine and then the kind of hips, and then you draw a leg, and they're just lines and a leg, and then you do the arm, and then the other arm, and then you look back and you think, is that right? That's the kind of sketch of what it is the stance right? And then you sort of put a bit of flesh on the bones, and then you stand back and you think, is that how it should be? And it's this sort of repeated, it's like you're chiseling out the whole thing in its entirety, and it's managing to keep the whole picture in mind when you deal with the details, and not let the details either overwhelm or take you off on a tangent that isn't sort of particularly relevant to the story at hand. I mean, is that similar to the way you work? How does it work for you?
For me, it's more just like trying to process a feeling into symbols and words so that it feels like something by the end. It's more like trying to organize a sound or music. So I don't know. I'm sure there are always similarities in what we do, but to me, it's the scale of that. Someone else could have spent 15 years doing that and not doing a design job and doing covers and logos at the same time. So it seems like a lot of condensed work. And also, as I said to you before, I mean, I think that the prose itself is really, there's such clarity and precision to it. And I wonder, what kind of influence did you have in that sense as a writer rather than as an artist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've not done a lot of writing before, but because I used to do a lot of illustration and design for advertising, and there were loads of things that I disliked about advertising, but one of the object lessons of advertising is less is more. If you can say something if you can say something in 10 words, then you can say the same thing in 5 words, that's better. If you can say it in 2 words, that's even better. So it's that precision and clarity that is what you're aiming for. Having said that, there are passages in XX, especially the Ascension bit, where our sort of character that we follow is very sort of baroque and wordy. So, and as is the 19th count. So, I can get florid when florid is what you need to be. But I think it's that it just comes from that sort of way of editing. And quite often you would get text when you were, say, designing a poster, and someone would send you the text that goes on this poster, and you could cut half of it out, and you wouldn't lose any of the meaning whatsoever. And it would just make for a more impactful, and it would communicate whatever the idea was faster and more powerfully than it would do otherwise. So it's clarity, clarity, clarity. And what I dislike books or any sort of form of art really, which doesn't really know what it's saying, and so doesn't say anything with any form of clarity. And I think it's okay to not know what you're saying, but that's kind of what your sketchbook is for. That's you kind of working it all out. That's you in private. And I think that by the time you're actually sort of putting on a performance, it's the difference between sort of noodling away on your guitar in private and then having a killer sort of 3-minute pop single. They're not the same thing by any means. And I think that what your audience want to hear is the killer 3-minute pop single. They don't want to hear you sort of doing sound checks interminably for hour upon hour.
Yeah, unless you become really famous and they're even interested in that.
Well, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and from there is the idea of, like I say, all those styles. Would you consider this a modernist work? Because I always think modernism actually follows postmodernism.
Sorry, say that again, Grant. No?
I believe that modernism actually tends to follow postmodernism rather than precede it.
I think you may be right, but we're going to have to define modernism. How would you define both modernism and postmodernism?
I think postmodernism is way more kind of self-reflexive and aware of the ironies of what it's doing, whereas modernism is quite flagrantly employing all kinds of methods to achieve the specific effect it's looking for. And sometimes they can be confused, the notion of using pastiche or like you do in this, actually recreating a story from a sci-fi pulp. But modernism, to me, it's like House of Leaves. It's like when I mention Goethe, or when I mention Joyce. There's just a sense of pulling from everywhere to create a compendium like Moby Dick, pulling from all kinds of sources in order to express an idea. Whereas, like I say, I think postmodernism is kind of reflexive and ironic, and it doesn't have the same communicative drive. I think it's more performative. But that's my take. But
yeah, no, I would. I'd go along with most of that. I think that what they both have in common is an awareness of form, an awareness of what form means, and where they're different, I would say, is that modernism wasn't just an art movement; it was a political movement. So I would say that communism is sort of, or even fascism, is modernism in the political sphere. It's trying to arrange. Modernism is trying to arrange everything in a very rational, scientific, logical fashion. Whereas postmodernism sort of understands that sort of modernism might just be another style along with a million other styles. Modernism is no more the ultimate answer to communication than Art Nouveau or punk or any other stylistic conceit might be. But what I think is interesting is I think that there are all these overlaps between cultural pursuits like novel writing and graphic design and fashion and things like that are very eclectic, and they borrow from everywhere, and they regurgitate old themes, and they sort of reference say fashion might be a language where we sort of reference things in the past, and people get that reference, and they know because your clothes are this kind of shape or color that you're speaking about this kind of milieu, and there are ideas that are associated with that. So it's not just the color and the shape, it's the ideas which these communicate. So I think we're all very au fait with that, even if we don't analyze it. We know what flares mean, we know what a top hat means, we know what all of these things mean. Whereas modernism sort of seeks to sort of strip it all away, and so you get the sort of the Chairman Mao sort of worker's outfit, which is like the universal clothing for the universal person, where you have pockets everywhere, and it's a kind of khaki color, and everyone wears the same hat.
Yeah, it's mass produced. It's mass production, isn't it? It's part of
yes.
it.
But
the ability to reproduce the image led to a kind of notion of being able to reproduce ideas, which I think takes us into capitalism and the idea of a perfect burger or a perfect loaf of bread or a perfect shoe.
yeah. But I think people are not machines, and I think that where communism and fascism both go wrong is they assume that we're the house is a machine for living. They assume that we basically get up at a certain hour, we sort of have 3.5 minutes of breakfast, and then we go downstairs and we go to the factory and we screw widgets all day, and then we come back and we spend half an hour of sort of useful recreational time from 7 to 7:30 reading Lenin, and that's how.
And all of those stages can be predicted and assured, because they fit into it's the time and motion study allow for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the idea that you can do time and motion studies on people as if they're just another thing that works efficiently in a factory. And so I think that on the one hand, modernism sort of brought us the Enlightenment, rationality, the scientific method, mathematics, all of these things sort of lifted us out of the kind of pre-Enlightenment world of sort of religious ideas and superstitious ideas and magical thinking. I mean, you might have some stuff to say on magical thinking, but so I think it's the misapplication of ideas or the over-application of ideas. So modernism and rationality and that 20th century machine age vision completely works with mathematics and science and everything like that. It doesn't work with human beings, because human beings are different, they're individual, they're illogical, they have their own ideas, they don't all fit the same mold. So I think what we have in modern society is we have almost the flip side of that, where people are attacking the kind of grand edifice of post-Enlightenment thought, the rationality of mathematics. They're attacking that because they're putting stories and personal anecdote up there as if it's equally valid. And in some ways it is valid on a personal level, but not on a scientific level. And I think that if fascism was or communism was the sort of over-application of modernism, then I think that the sort of postmodern world that we sometimes live in here, the post-truth world, people say we live in a post-truth world, I think that's the over-application of the flip side. That's the over-application of the personal and the individual and the non-universal.
Well, I think that the inability of postmodernism or the unwillingness to privilege any idea leads ultimately to chaotic confusion in the end, because some ideas are better than others, and that's part of what
absolutely
as well. The ideas, there is an ecology of ideas, and some are stronger, and some are better, and maybe we should replace some of the ghastly ones with ones that work better. But postmodernism tends to not. It's appalled with the notion of privileging one idea above another. There's a sense of subjectivity that has to be adhered to, except in the sense that postmodernism privileges its own view. Always that. So there's always going to be that contradiction. But I think that's what it is, and you talk about that in the book. It's like the way to fight bad ideas is with better ideas.
No, I agree, and I think that's one of the sort of major themes of the book is the kind of the 19th Count XX and Girl 21 sort of represent the age of privilege and aristocracy and tradition, the 20th century, the age of modernism and the sort of horrors, but also the successes and the advances that came with that. And then sort of Girl 21, I have no real idea. Where do you think this century is going to go, Grant? What's going to be?
I think if we're to survive at all, we need to get away from the old men, the strong men, leaders who are pretty ancient, and this pretense of virility that they project, and this absolute domination of nature, I think is not going to work out for us long term. So I do believe that the energies that we're seeing coming from the margins, from thanks to the internet, like women's voices are louder, queer voices are louder. We're seeing these things like manifest, and I really do think we just need a bit more. The girls should take over, and I think that's what I like of the Girl 21 character. The structure of those three characters even ties into the Aleister Crowley's metaphor of the three aeons. Well, the first 2,000 years of recorded history were attributed to the goddess Isis. So time was cyclical, and people, lived by the earth, and they watched the stars, and they planted and did their thing. Second 2,000 years from the birth of Christ were the age of Osiris, who's the lawgiver, and that's when ideas are coded into language and into books. And the god can survive for thousands of years because if he's written down, if his programming instructions are written down, anyone who reads them can be programmed by those ideas and become an agent of God. After that comes the age of Horus, who's the fiery sun, the jihadi, the rebel, the rock star, who tears everything down just for the hell of it to make something new. And alongside him comes his twin Mat, who's the goddess of truth in Egypt. And I honestly think Crowley was talking in metaphorical terms of how cultures, shifted. And the idea that I think we have to follow the aeon of the lawgiver and his son, the destroyer, the hero boy, with something a bit more networked, a bit more feminine, a bit more, just take the power out of the hands of mad old sociopaths.
Yeah, that's
and I think it may be our only chance, but your characters also fit into this aeonic progression, that the XX is Horus, this destructive, creative, rebel energy, and Girl 21 is Mat, goddess of truth. It's like, okay, this is how it actually is. We get it. We've seen everyone's porn now. We've seen we've seen what you want and what you need and how pathetic you are. So where do we go from here?
There are no secrets.
Yeah.
But
then, again, so ideas, because the book is about ideas, and the danger of ideas and the fact that, you know, I've said before that we protect our money behind, you know, in banks. We protect our data behind firewalls. We protect our homes with walls and, you know, our possessions, but we don't protect our heads at all. We're willing to let any old idea come in there without realizing the damage ideas can do. And we know they can also exalt and they can also make us better, but the damage is there. And I think in the book we really talk about that. It's the openness we have to ideas, which is almost ridiculous. We allow ourselves to be swayed and overwhelmed by completely immaterial things.
Do you think it's a bit like being possessed? Because I think that
I think it is being possessed. If you know, to use that language is absolutely correct with the notion of a non-material, let's call it an entity. It's not necessarily an entity, it's a non-material package of meaning that can completely overwhelm a human being. It can turn a normal boy into a suicide bomber.
Yeah. So I had this idea where the kind of fundamental unit of consciousness is not the human being, it's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just sort of vessels through which ideas propagate. So they're just sort of using us to sort of spread, and there's this whole sort of ecosystem out there of sort of good ideas, bad ideas, indifferent ideas. I mean, the ideas don't know whether they're good or bad or indifferent. They're incapable of knowing whether they're good or bad or indifferent. They just propagate or don't propagate, depending on how virulently infective they are. They're like, you know, just like a disease doesn't know whether it's moral or immoral. It doesn't have a moral perspective whatsoever. How could it? So one of the ideas in the book was that we're kind of almost proxies for these ideas which sweep back and forth across the globe. And it used to be in the 20th century that these ideas were propagated mainly by sort of books and lectures and then sort of film and television. And now the main vector is the internet, which I think is why a sort of a good idea or a bad idea can travel so far, so fast. And everyone knows exactly what's happening on the other side of the world. Whereas in the past, you know, you would have, I'm sure people 2,000 years ago could have lived lifetimes without having any idea what was happening on the other side of the globe. They would just had no way of finding out. Yeah. They might as well have been on different planets. But now we're so interconnected. And I think that the upshot of that, I think that a lot of the reasons why we get these very powerful movements, you know, for good and for bad, is because of that interconnectivity and the fact that the idea, if it's a powerful idea, can just travel so far, so fast. And you know, we have COVID now, which is sort of a metaphor for that. And people talk about sort of COVID going viral. Well, the viruses were going viral before the ideas were going viral, but the metaphor is so apt, I think. And
we do seem to be very vulnerable to that kind of attack. You know, as we used to have a way of looking at conflict, which was Manichaean. It's almost two great powers, you know, versus one another. It'd be one country versus another, one creed versus another, one big idea versus another. But now the viral creep, the thing that gets underneath us, we seem to be very vulnerable to that. And as you say, I think COVID is just the, you know, as above, so below, as they say in Hermeticism, that these things reflect on all scales. You know, we are so vulnerable to ideas that get in, and they have no weight. You know, as I've said, what is the weight of the meaning of Hamlet? We know it exists, but we can't weigh it. So is it an ascientific concept? Is it, you know, because science and reason allows us to measure and to divide the universe, but we can't do it with ideas. They are non-material and yet they have physical effects.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about them. I think the fundamental sort of division is between nature and culture. And I think a lot of disagreements come where people mix these two things up, or they don't realize that they are, in fact, two different things. So nature doesn't care about culture. I mean, the dinosaurs were around for way longer than we will ever be around. Did they have a culture? Did they reflect on the nature of the universe? Did they write books? Probably not. But the world doesn't care. You know, an asteroid comes along and does away with all that.
Mm-hmm.
So nature is absolutely immune to culture. So the facts are not immutable to our opinions. But there are people who think that opinions are kind of, you know, it's this Orwellian idea that if you can think in a certain way, then the world will be a certain way. You might be able to change the culture. You won't be able to change nature.
Mm-hmm.
And nature will always do what nature does, regardless of how we would want it to behave.
Well,
Nature
as we've seen right now, it's easy to lie about what's happening, but it's not really stopping what's happening. And those lies, as you say, that work on culture do not work on nature.
Well, I think there's always been leaders who are sort of great orators who sort of know the power of words and the power of argument. And this goes back, you know, right to, you know, the way that rhetoric would be taught if you were in Greece, say. It was considered to be sort of an important facet of any person's armory, if you like. And I think that it's not just being able to talk with persuasive power, it's being able to understand that other people are doing it to you, so that you have some kind of antibody against disinformation, against viral ideas, against simple ideas that sound seductive but are only seductive because they flatten all nuance into a slogan. And you can chant a slogan, but within that slogan, I mean, this is, again, you know, I was talking earlier about how one of the lessons of advertising is if you can take a word out, if you can take 5 words out, it makes it more powerful. But the flip side of that is that if you do remove nuance, and sometimes arguments aren't simple, and the powerful reduction of an argument to a slogan completely does away. You lose a lot of truth in that reduction. And I think, again, this is sort of how language works. And I think, I mean, what do you think? I mean, from a comic strip point of view, I think one of the things I like about comics is there's not really that much room on the comic page to go into vast digressions about sort of and all the rest of it. So you've got to be pretty succinct. So as a comic book writer, one of the things I really like about your work is the way that you can very sort of niftily boil down some really quite esoteric ideas into a page or 2 of sharp dialogue, and it's there. The idea is there. It's sort of that. Do you know what I mean?
I think it's that Denny O'Neil, the writer on Batman and of so many other things, who passed away recently. He said that the best comic book dialogue was headlines written by a poet, and so that stuck in my head. And I do love, you know, there comes a certain point you can't have too many words or else you're going to overwhelm the art. So it really is about counting the words in a lot of cases and making sure that there's just enough. And I do like the idea of being able to reduce the most esoteric concepts to a T-shirt or a badge. But yeah, I also see how that can be taken too seriously. But I wonder, as creative people, I don't take the word seriously. The word is just something that jumps through hoops for me. It's like a tiger in the circus. But for other people, I know the word is very important. It's a Bible or you know, a holy book would be super important. The word is inviolate. Whereas to me, the word is something that dances for me. So I don't know if maybe when you're dealing with it, it's like a guy who works in the sweet shop. You don't take them quite as seriously as the kids who are peering in the window.
Yeah.
And maybe that disconnects me from how powerful they can seem to other people.
But do you not think that's true of anyone who understands how something works? I mean, I don't understand how my car works, so I take it to the garage, and some bloke sort of, you know, will tell me my flange sprocket is broken, and I'll go, okay, cheers, mate, if you can fix that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a language that I don't speak. So, in fact, I talk about this in XX, how I think if you have a high degree of craft, it can seem to someone who is outside of that like magic. It's like the kind of, what was the thing that Arthur C. Clarke said, that any
sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic.
Yes, exactly.
But not even, I mean, any significantly advanced attention, you know, if you look at a conjurer, it looks like magic. Look at Derren Brown, or look at a great dancer, look at a great artist. They do things that seem like magic, but what they actually are is the result of attention and repetition, and being, paying attention to a very specific part of the universe and developing your abilities within that can look like magic to people who are not paying that same level of attention.
So how does magic, and I know I'm going to regret going down the magic wormhole here with you, but how is magic for you an entirely explicable thing in terms of everyday physics? There's nothing quote unquote supernatural about it, or is it?
I don't think, no, there's nothing supernatural about it, but things can happen which look so close to what we've been told is supernatural that it can be quite bizarre. So no, I really don't think. I think it's a very pragmatic way of paying attention to certain things, and if you give them certain names or certain states of mind that feel demonic, certain states of mind feel divine, and magic is using spells, which are just ways of encouraging certain states of consciousness. And those states of consciousness could be experienced as what feels like a god, or what feels like a demon, or what feels like. So that's the way I see it. It's purely down to what is your consciousness going through right now, and how do you stimulate that to get certain effects. And the interesting thing about magic is, if you do a ritual to Kali, you're unlikely to get Ganesh. These things, people have been working this out for a long time. How do you specifically stimulate the consciousness that feels like an encounter with this female spirit of destruction? And that's what it is. But it's what you're talking about. It's ideas. How do you specifically focus on an idea to the extent that it takes over everything? And once you have been completely taken over by an idea, you are enthused. You are now divine. And I think beyond that, it's not just a psychological thing, because that idea persists. It was here through history. People 500 years ago developed methods to also stimulate that idea into complete control of your nervous system. So the idea itself has a longevity that outlives human beings, which gives it again the strange aura of the divine or the supernatural. But it's not, it's just the persistence of an idea through time, like love or hate, that we can all feel. But what is the aggregate of all the love and hate ever felt? Well, that's the God of love, that's the God of hate.
So it's the idea in the abstract, it's the
I don't think it's even not abstract, because it can't be abstract. The minute it becomes abstract, it goes into the realm of the supernatural. It's not abstract, it's everyone can feel love. So what is love? What is the element that is love that all human organisms can have an experience of, that persists through time, that outlives our specific lifetimes, but it's still there? You can listen to a love song from before you were born, and it can still stimulate the same feelings. So those feelings have a reality that is out with, our specific individual experience, and that would be what, by any other name, would be a god.
Yeah. I sort of talk about sort of gods in XX and sort of describe them as sort of powerful viral ideas. So I'm not sure that is exactly what you're talking
about. What you actually talk about, you say that they're basically self-begotten ideas.
Yes.
It's a fascinating thing, because why not in a universe that is, that is expressing itself and using any means to express itself without an end point, just with the algorithm that's reproduce, move out, reproduce. If you create that algorithm, then you have a universe that is self-expressive. So there can be, like you say, like in the book, the Andromeda galaxy is self-aware, but in a horrible way. And the self-awareness, it faces shock when it encounters other things like it, but not like it. And I think, those types of self-engendered ideas might be able to exist as well.
Yeah. So, but here's a question: would God cease to exist if human beings cease to exist?
Well, possibly. Would love cease to exist if human beings cease to exist, or would it express itself as the attraction between two particles? I don't know. Is love really, for us, is the sense of the attraction that exists between particles as
the universe we just participate in?
Yeah, and for us, that has all kinds of extra meanings and curlicues, and we can write poems and songs about it. But really, it is that sense of there's attraction and there's repulsion, and maybe we just add a lot of meaning to that. But I don't know. So maybe you could take us out of the equation, and something like love, which is basic attraction between particles, would still exist until the end of time.
No, I like that idea. So we kind of we get a sort of gist of what particles feel.
I kind of think human consciousness, we're really good receivers, and that's what we do. And I think what we call consciousness is probably another field.
What do you think consciousness is, Grant? Because I have my ideas and I kind of try and explore them a bit.
I think it's a field like gravity. I think it can't be created or destroyed. It's like matter or energy, and I think consciousness is the next thing in that chain. It occurs when nervous systems get sufficiently complex and suddenly we become receivers for something that's there, an immanent sense of itself. And we start to tap into that. And the highest levels of that and very high level meditation is a kind of, all awareness of all things happening simultaneously. So clearly there is something there that we can reach. If we can feel that kind of non-dual experience, then I think it's probably something that is just simply there that we are particularly well developed to pick up on.
Speaking of higher consciousness, sorry.
Yeah, hi.
Like the voice of the Mysterons. I wondered if now would be a good time to sort of look at some questions from the audience.
Yes, let's do it before we drift ever further into the abstract.
I know we started a wee bit late, so we'll run over.
That's fine.
Are you all right to kind of look at the ask a question box and go, or is that?
Well, do you want to read a few out for us, Jamie? That's probably the best.
Yeah, I can do that.
Then everyone can know what question we're actually answering.
Great. Okay.
Pick some sensible ones.
Oh, really? Okay, cool. Okay, I'll start off with, if you had one font to send into the galaxy, which would it be?
Well, I have my favourite fonts. Well, there are two parts to that question. One is, what would be the best font in terms of communicating with aliens? And that would probably be, whenever anyone has sent a message out, it's always been something to do with mathematics or some, the atomic weight of hydrogen or something that will be universal. So it's been mathematic rather than cultural. I was talking earlier about the difference between maths and culture, and obviously aliens are not going to be able to understand anything that's cultural to us at all. So it has to be something universal. As to my favourite font, the one that I really like is called Microgrammar. And the reason I like that is because it was used by Kubrick in 2001. It was used by Jerry Anson on the side of the Shadow mobiles in UFO. It's that kind of slightly squarish and extended font that, for me, just kind of screams 1960s sort of optimistic, futuristic modernism. And in the novel, I actually use it like my characters.
That's the Intelligentsia logo, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I go off on a bit of a tangent about this is why they use this font. And in fact, in the review in the Financial Times, I was hauled over the coals for being a font nerd about enthusing about this. But anyway,
come on, if you can't be a font nerd, Ryan, so you've invented more fonts than anyone else.
Okay. Grant, do you have one that you would send into space, or anything you hate?
No, I mean, I hate a few of them, but the one I like is just that classic. You'll know the name of it, Ryan, the kind of Apollo 11, that 70s thing, that slightly bubbly with the thin lines. It's got a name, but I don't know what it is.
You mean it's Countdown?
Yeah, Countdown, the one that they had in that comic.
Well, yes. Well, I'll tell you a story about that very font. I know what you mean. It looks like one of those optical character recognition fonts. The numbers that appeared on checks that had like weird thick and thin.
Exactly.
And then
it was very much 70s science fiction. It was like we're all going to Mars by 1984. It was the promise, the utopian promise.
They broke our promise.
Yeah.
No, that font is called Countdown. And here's the bizarre thing: is that my dad, who was an architect, bought home from the office a sheet of Countdown, and I must have been about 5 or 6 or something. And so that that font went on all of my school books and my cassette tapes. You know, where you record things off the radio on Sunday afternoon, and then you'd make your own cassette inlays. So mine were all done in that Countdown font. And then many, many years later, I meet Alan Meeks, who was the designer of Countdown. And so I was kind of enthusing to him about this as if he was some kind of rock superstar. And I think he was quite taken aback that sort of this meant anything to anyone. But obviously, complete font nerd, this was, oh my God.
We've got a slightly different question now from Paul Thomas. How did DJ Food become involved in the project?
DJ Food, aka Strictly Kev, is a friend of mine who has a massive interest in comics, in science fiction, in the backwaters of the most obscure music you could possibly imagine. Did a great album called The Search Engine, which I urge people to go out and listen to. DJ Food was another of the people who sort of got an early copy of XX, and I said to him, I showed him the fake review. There's like a pretentious music journalist sort of review of an album made from the signals from space, in which I sort of regurgitate every pretentious musical term, like it's a sonic cathedral of sound, for example. And I said to him, can you make this album? You know, we've got the review. Can you take the review as your brief and make this album? And so he did. And it's freaking brilliant. And so go, it's on Bandcamp. And also my sister Saren, who's sort of a classically trained pianist, was a good foil because he sort of comes at it. There's a massive library of free to use NASA sound samples. So you have sort of the bleeps and ticks of the Voyager probe sending signals from beyond Pluto. You have Cassini sort of dipping through the rings of Saturn and sending signals back from there. And these are all sounds which you can use for free. So he took that, but then what Saren did was introduce this sort of classical piano that sort of softened it and humanized it. And the two are so different, but they go together really well. And then the weird thing was, is that I had a recording of my dad reading one of his poems, and it was just like this random thing that my brother-in-law had recorded on his phone some years ago before my dad passed away. And the sort of theme of this poem was very much sort of in tune with the final chapters of XX, these sort of somewhat transcendental ideas of reincarnation and spiritual rebirth. And Kev worked that in as well in a really incredible way. So he sort of took snippets of my dad's voice and then used them in some tracks. And then on the sort of putative side too, there's it's like a 3-movement piece, and the centerpiece is my dad reading this poem. So it's a nice sort of tribute. I don't think he ever thought we'd do this with this, but it sort of fits and it works really well.
Okay, thank you. A few people have asked questions along this line, but have either of you considered working together on future projects?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've done a lot over the years, and the last thing we did was a great story in heavy metal. But yeah, I mean, it will likely happen again, I'm sure.
No, absolutely. No, yeah, Grant wrote 2 or 3 stories for me in heavy metal a couple of years ago, which I did. We worked on a thing called The Key for the BBC, which was sort of reformatted and reprinted in heavy metal. So we're always kicking ideas around. I think the problem is that there's no way that I'll be able to draw a regular comic. I just, I don't have the time. However fast I can work, I can't do a regular American comic on top of, and I don't think my style really lends itself to that anyway. But the more sort of pop culture-y stuff that Grant and I sort of get involved with. I mean, Grant, one thing I really admire about Grant is how he can completely write to the strengths of the artist. So it's not like you just get a story; it's a story for you. And I think that he really understands what an artist can sort of bring to a specific story. So I'm sure we will do stuff in future. I'm sure we will.
Watch this space, yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Cool. Okay, and let me just see who this is. So Ken has asked, obviously the book's out today, but if there were to be interest in a film or TV version, who would you choose in the adaptation? I guess there's a few things, like who would you like to kind of work on the movie, and then who would you see as kind of some of the characters?
I think that the perfect person who has done you'll probably be able to guess who this is, because he sort of co-wrote a book called S, which
Yeah,
I'm sure you're familiar with. It's J.J. Abrams, and I think that he sort of has that sort of understanding of the form of the thing as being a parallel but separate thing from the content of the thing. And S was all about that. It was just beautifully done. You know, it came in a slipcase, and you took out this beautifully designed book, and typographically it was fantastic. And then in the marginalia of the actual novel, you have two people having a relationship in two different handwritings. And then within the book, there are postcards and napkins and other sort of ephemera. So, you know, the understanding of it's what I call the thingness of the thing, the objectness of the object. You know, it's what a designer understands as part of his job, is that whatever the thing is, whether that be a record sleeve or a book jacket or a comic book, the thing in and of itself is as important as the art and the writing and the music. These are all a creative work in and of itself. It's a whole, and if you ignore any one of those elements to your detriment. And I think that J.J. Abrams is one of the few people who actually understands the form of the thing that he works in. So who knows? I'm saying
it would be good television. It would make a great television show, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, because there's so much a film couldn't contain it, but a TV show would be great.
Yeah.
And it's a good thriller as well. I mean, that's what everything. We're talking about these high level ideas, but it's a really great science fiction thriller.
That's what the reviews are saying. So this is for both of you, from Sean Dillon. Which work of yours do you feel is the most overlooked?
Can we answer for each other? Because I think St. Swithin's Grant's most overlooked works. I think it's brilliant, and it should come out again.
Yeah, well, I mean, for you, I mean, I don't think you have any overlooked work, do you? Do you? You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what's overlooked. Times change, and people see importance in things that maybe you didn't see importance at the time.
Yeah.
The things I like the best, the weirdest things, like the filth and sea guy for me. I mean, but for Ryan, I think, you know, your work is that Soho Divas thing you did. I think, you know, it's so unlike anything else you've done, and it's so captures a moment. It's like Weimar Germany, you know, and I don't think people know enough about that. It might just be seen as a kind of, you know, sexy girl art book, but it's not. It's like snapshots of a time that can never come. So something like that for me would be your overlooked work.
I was really happy with that book. I mean, I had so much
material. Because it's a social document. It's not, you know.
Yeah.
But it's also just done with your usual, you know, your absoluteness.
Yeah, no, I did really like that, and I did another book, sort of another album, but of the similar material, because I didn't stop drawing those burlesque portraits when the book came out. I continued. I've not obviously been doing it recently. So there's another book's worth that probably no one will see. Unfortunately, the first book didn't sell like hotcakes, so it might be hard to persuade a publisher to do a second.
Hence, overlooked.
It's overlooked, absolutely. But I'll send you a copy, Grant, because I've got a you know, one of those sort of print on demand sort of prototype versions. So
I've got a lovely version of it, which is, you know, this kind of cloth cover, almost this textured cover.
Yeah, that's the one that Image did, and they did a really beautiful job on it. It's got like different types of paper, so it's got shiny paper and matte paper. The second book, which is unpublished, only exists as a prototype, but I'll send you one. You'll love it. So it'll be right.
All right.
I love how nerdy this is getting with just like the look and the feel of the paper. And I know we've previously talked about book sniffing. Okay, so I think that's probably about time. Thank you so much to everyone for sending in your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all of them. And thank you so much to Grant for joining us and talking with Ryan. And a huge thank you to Ryan for this wonderful book from everyone at Picador and Pang Macmillan. So cheers.
Oh, cheers. I think we've lost Grant, but cheers, Grant.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
So there we have it. The mighty Grant Morrison and the mighty Rian Hughes talking about the amazing achievement that is XX. I really couldn't recommend this book hardly enough. It is a unique piece of work, and you can order it from the links attached right here. Until next time, take care, everyone. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.